Once upon a time, in the heart of the medieval ages, nestled between gentle hills and the winding trails of wild thyme and bramble, there lay a village known as Farsley. This hamlet, modest in its countenance, was cradled by thick woods and guarded by the whispering oaks that had stood for generations. To the eye, it seemed a painting from a bard's dream. Smoke rising in lazy coils from thatched roofs, chickens wandering freely beneath timber-framed homes, and the bells of distant sheep echoing like lullabies across the meadows. Yet beneath the surface of such rustic peace brewed a truth as chilling as the mountain mist. Illness, when it came like a quiet executioner. This is a story not just of Farsley, but of a time when the body's betrayal meant far more than discomfort. It meant dread. A tale of how a mere cuff or a sour stomach could unravel one's life like a poorly spun thread. In 20 parts, we shall journey through the causes, beliefs, and grim outcomes of falling ill during these shadowed centuries. And so our story begins. It was in late summer, when the wheat wore its golden crown and the orchard trees bowed heavy with ripening fruit, that young Elric, the village cooper's apprentice, first began to cough. He was a robust boy of 15 winters, known for his laughter and the way he could heave barrels twice his size. But on that humid morning, as he hammered at a hoop of iron, he paused, gripped his chest, and coughed again. No one thought much of it then. Old Maud, the baker's widow, remarked it was likely the dust from the saw pit or a draft from sleeping too near the door. After all, the air had turned a touch fickle since the last storm, and many a villager had caught a sniffle or two. But when Elric failed to appear the next day, or the day after that, whispers began curling like smoke around the village square. Master Ranulph, the cooper himself, visited Elric's cottage, where he found the boy pale and trembling, his skin slick with sweat and his breath shallow. The small, timber-walled room reeked of sickness, the sourness of vomit, the iron tang of blood, and something deeper, a scent no one could name, but all feared. His mother, Thilda, hovered like a shade beside him, her hands raw from soaking cloths in cold well water and pressing them to his forehead. She had not slept. Her eyes were rimmed red, and her voice was a hoarse whisper. She had begged the priest. She had begged the herbs woman. She had even begged the bees, leaving out offerings at the hives at twilight, as her own grandmother had done when pestilence last swept through. But none of it worked. For in this age, disease was not seen as a product of unseen creatures or shared touch. It was understood as a divine retribution or a corruption of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When imbalanced, the body suffered. That much everyone knew. But how to restore balance? That answer varied like the shifting winds. Elric's ailment seemed to defy all logic. He had not wandered into the marshes where the mists grew thick and foul. He had not drunk too deeply from the ale barrel or gorged himself upon spoiled meat. The symptoms were spectral: fever, wheezing, coughing streaked with crimson, then silence followed by hours of stillness, as if the sickness itself waited, watching. Word spread. Villagers began crossing the road rather than walking past the cooper's cottage. Thilda found scraps of parchment pinned to her door with blessed symbols drawn in charcoal. No one would fetch water with her at the well. No one would take the bread she offered in trade. It was as though she too had been marked by her son's unseen affliction. The herbswoman, Mistress Grithilde, was the only one brave or mad enough to approach. A wizened crone with a crown of heather always woven into her graying hair, she spoke little and watched much. She brought with her a poultice of horehound and elderflower and left juniper burning on a saucer by the hearth to cleanse the air. She muttered Latin prayers as she worked, though none knew if she truly understood the tongue or simply repeated what the monks once taught her as a girl. Still, Elric worsened. The fever rose, a tide no herb could stem. His eyes sank deep into his face, and his cough turned wet and guttural, as if something inside him clawed to get out. On the 7th day, his breath faltered, caught like cloth on a thorn, and then it ceased altogether. Just before the silence fell, he murmured a name, though none knew whose. The priest, Father Alwyn, came at dusk to anoint the body. He brought holy oil and a bell, which he rang thrice as he stepped across the threshold. "Deliver this soul," he intoned, his voice hollow in the silence of the death room. Tilda wept quietly as he murmured psalms. Mistress Grithild did not join the prayer. She watched the smoke from the juniper curl toward the rafters and whispered something older, something deeper. Elric was buried at the edge of the cemetery, his grave dug in haste and filled before the Bell of Lauds. A stone was placed, not carved, just a marker to say someone had once been. And just like that, he was gone. But Farsley would not forget, for Elric's passing was not the end. It was the beginning. The breath of illness had passed over the threshold, and it was not finished. The morning after Elric's burial dawned with an eerie stillness. Even the birds seemed subdued, their songs hesitant, as if they too had paused in mourning. The mist clung to the village paths longer than usual, draping the hedgerows in a gauzy veil. In the town square, gossip moved slower, carried in hushed tones by those unwilling to speak too loudly of what might yet linger in the air. At the heart of the stirrings stood Father Alwyn, a solemn man with eyes like weathered stone and hands always folded in silent prayer. But even he, schooled in the teachings of Scripture and long practiced in the rites of the ill and dying, could offer little comfort. The boy had perished, not of sword or sin, but of something that could not be seen, touched, or reasoned with. By midweek, concern blossomed into dread. Another villager, a flax spinner named Beatrix, fell ill. Her hands, once so quick and graceful with thread, trembled uncontrollably. Her breath shortened. Her skin grew pale, then flushed, then pale again. A pattern emerged, the same fever, the same crimson cough, the same end. It was then that word was sent to Harrogate Abbey, half a day's ride beyond the northern ridge. Farsley could no longer rely on village knowledge and peasant prayers. They needed a learned man, a physician. 2 days later, he arrived on horseback with a leather case strapped behind his saddle and a silver clasp on his cloak. Markings of his education at Salerno, where the great medical texts of Galen and Hippocrates were still studied, though mostly from crumbling Latin translations. His name was Magister Isambard, and he spoke slowly and formally, as if every word had been weighed on a scholar's scale. He wore a dark tunic lined with linen, and his hands were always gloved, even when touching only parchment. When he dismounted, the villagers parted like the sea, each bowing subtly as he passed, not out of respect, but in the desperate hope that knowledge might offer protection where prayers had failed. In Thilda's cottage, he made his first examination. Elric's body had long since been buried, but the room was unchanged and the air still heavy. Isambard opened the shutters, sniffed, then lit a sprig of rosemary to cleanse the miasma. He requested a basin of water, a stool, and silence. His diagnosis, when finally offered, was delivered with grave authority. The balance of humors, he pronounced, has been shattered. This idea of 4 humors within the body, each linked to an element and temperament, was central to all medieval medicine. Blood, air, phlegm, water, yellow bile, fire, and black bile, earth, were believed to govern both health and mood. To live in harmony, one's humors must remain in equilibrium. Illness, then, was simply the result of imbalance. In young Elric's case, Isambard declared, there was excess phlegm and black bile, signs of a cold and moist temperament overwhelming the body's natural fire. The lungs were too full, the spirits dampened. It sounded learned, reassuring even. The villagers listened intently, nodding as if understanding the gravity of such internal weather. But when they asked what could be done, his answer rang hollow. He prescribed a regimen of bloodletting for the afflicted. It will draw out the excess, he explained, and restore heat to the heart. For those not yet showing signs, he recommended purging, herbs that would induce vomiting or loosen the bowels, to cleanse the body of toxins before they could take root. He was given access to the village chapel for his work. One by one, the sick were brought to him. Beatrix, weak but conscious, Godric the herdsman, who had begun to cough just the night before, and Aldwin, a boy of 10 whose only complaint was a persistent chill. To each, he applied his methods. A shallow incision in the crook of the arm, blood gathered in a ceramic bowl, the color and thickness noted. For purging, he brewed draughts of hellebore and wormwood, foul-tasting but potent. Beatrix died that night. Godric worsened within hours. And Aldwin, who had walked to the chapel with little more than shivers, was found pale and lifeless the following dawn, blood still pooled in the bowl beside him. Yet Isambard did not waver. To treat imbalance, he insisted, The cause must be expelled. The humors do not lie. Some villagers began to question him, but others, driven by desperation, clung to his words. After all, what alternative was there? The local herbswoman, Mistress Grithild, muttered darkly at the mention of leeching and purging. She watched from a distance, refusing to let Isambard near her home or her tonic brewed teas. This is not a matter of phlegm and bile, she told Tilda, who had become more a wraith than a woman since her son's passing. This is a sickness of breath and shadow. It travels not through the blood, but through the wind. But Grithild's wisdom was born of earth, not ink. Her remedies involved thistle and nettle, lunar timings, and smoke-filled jars. To most, she was a relic. Respected, yes, but seen as little more than a superstitious vestige of older times. Isambard, on the other hand, wore the garb of reason. He wrote notes in fine script, spoke of Hippocrates and Aristotle, and quoted the texts of Avicenna. That he failed, again and again, did not seem to disprove his standing. 3 more perished before the week was out. The villagers began lighting tallow candles in their windows and keeping salt at their doorways. They whispered to one another about the bad air, the invisible hand that crept from house to house, choosing its victims. They feared it might be punishment from God, or worse, a curse from the fens to the south, where no one dared go. Still, Isambard remained. Still, he bled the sick and purged the weary. Still, he believed the humors would yield, if only treated with precision. But the illness was not governed by balance. It did not heed the rules written in centuries-old scrolls. It moved with a will of its own, and Isambard, for all his learning, could not stop it. In the village of Farsley, faith in medicine began to crumble, and far beyond, others were beginning to fall ill. At the edge of Farsley, where the fields gave way to creeping ivy and hawthorn thickets, there stood a cottage more ancient than any other in the village. Its beams were blackened by time, its roof thick with moss, and its windows narrow slits of horn-glazed light. This was the home of Mistress Grithild, the herbswoman, whose very name whispered of yesteryear. Grithild had lived through more winters than most could count. Her back was bent like a crescent moon, her hands knotted like roots, but her eyes, sharp and black as onyx, missed nothing. Children were told never to stray too close to her hedge, and yet every mother in Farsley had, at one time or another, knocked timidly at her door with a child in fever or a babe too weak to nurse. She spoke little, preferred the company of plants, and kept a black cat with one white paw. The villagers called her wise, though some said the word with the same fear they used when speaking of thunder in the night. With the physician's treatments failing and more villagers succumbing, eyes turned once more to Grithild, not with reverence, but with a growing desperation. Even Father Alwyn, who had long warned against reliance on her pagan methods, offered no protest when the first families began seeking her aid. Her garden was not of the usual sort. There were no neat rows of vegetables or bursts of color from roses and marigolds. Instead, it was a wild array of greens and browns, of twisted stalks and curling leaves. Strange wooden signs marked each patch, written not in Latin, but in older, curving script long forgotten by most. There were plants for fever, yarrow, feverfew, and willowbark. Others for cleansing the air, hyssop, sage, and sweetgrass. And a few, kept in shadowed corners, for dreams and death, henbane, nightshade, and belladonna. Grithild's approach to illness differed entirely from that of Magister Isambard. Where he spoke of humors and balance, she spoke of winds and spirits. To her, sickness was not a thing within, but without, a force that moved through the world like fog across the moor. It could be trapped, slowed, or turned away. And to do so, one needed more than a blade and basin. When young Tomlin, the miller's son, fell ill, the first child since Aldwyn, his mother, Ilsa, ignored the physician and fled straight to Grithild. She carried the boy wrapped in a woolen cloak, his head fevered, and his lips cracked with thirst. Grithild took the child without question. She lit a bundle of herbs and waved it thrice over his body, chanting in low tones. She bathed him in cool spring water infused with elder and chamomile. She hung a pouch of juniper and rowan above his bed and sat beside him all through the night, whispering to the flickering candle flame as if it could hear. By dawn, Tomlin's fever had broken. It was the first recovery the village had seen since the illness began. Ilsa wept in gratitude, pressing a silver button, the only one from her wedding bodice, into Gritild's hand. Word of the healing spread like fire in dry hay. The sick who had not yet fallen fully into the illness were carried to the edge of the woods. Gritild did not turn them away, though she warned each that her ways were not without cost. They must follow the rhythm of the land, she told them, and give what is owed. The rituals were peculiar. Houses were to be swept widdershins, counter to the sun's path. Bread was to be broken at dusk and placed at crossroads for the spirits of the wind. No one was to speak the name of the dead for 3 days after their passing. To many, these customs seemed strange and superstitious. But Farsley was changing. Hope, even if born of elder traditions, was a balm the people craved. And when 2 more began to recover under Gritild's care, a tanner's wife and an aging shepherd, faith in the old ways grew. Magister Isambard took these events poorly. He called Gritild's remedies mountebank tricks and accused her of conjuring illusion through coincidence and fear. But even he could not deny the growing ledger of those who lived. His own cures had brought naught but suffering, and the glances he once received with admiration had turned cold and cautious. Gritild did not confront him. She tended her garden, boiled her tinctures, and spoke little. Yet inside her mind, memories stirred. Memories of the last time illness had come like this, decades ago, when she was but a girl learning from her grandmother. Then, too, the physicians had come. Then, too, they had failed. But her grandmother had known the signs, the patterns in birdsong, the color of sunrise mist, the way shadows bent at midday. Illness, she had said, was not merely in the body, it was in the village itself, in its mood, its fear, its forgetting of old truths. And Gritild, though aged, remembered. Each morning, she burned herbs at the boundaries of Farsley. Each evening, she left milk on the hearth for the household spirits. She warned the people to close their shutters at night and speak kindly to their dreams. Not all sickness is of flesh, she told Ilse once. Some enters through sorrow, some rides on silence. The people listened now, and slowly, tentatively, the tide began to shift. Not all who came to Gritild were saved, but enough were. Enough to cast doubt on the wisdom of bleeding and bile. Enough to make the villagers wonder if the world was broader than parchment scrolls and leeches. But the illness had not gone. It merely waited, deeper now, coiling in places yet untouched. For far beyond Farsley, past the woods and hills and abbeys, other villages had begun to fall silent. The wind carried more than whispers, and Gritild could feel its weight in her bones. There was more to come, and not even the old ways could stop what had begun. The bell of St. Osyth's chapel tolled 3 times each morning, its voice deep and mournful, rising like a sigh over the rooftops of Farsley. Once it had rung in celebration, baptisms, weddings, feast days bright with song, but now it rang almost daily for another reason entirely, death. Gone were the days of careful rites and gathered kin, of clean linen shrouds and graves lined with herbs. Now burials were swift and shrouds were tattered. There were too many fallen, too few hands to dig. The villagers came to fear the dead, not their souls but their bodies, corrupted dangerous. Father Alwyn, though resolute, kept his distance now. He murmured prayers through cloth and sorrow. The bell sometimes rang before the burial, warning others to shut their doors. Cedric the gravedigger, once stout and steady, had grown thin and worn. His hands trembled. His songs had gone silent. He dug by moonlight, dug by fog. Even the children, once wild and curious, no longer ventured near the linden tree at the cemetery's edge. Its branches hung low, like arms too tired to reach. But most grievous of all was the loss of farewell. When Elric passed, his mother sang him into silence. Now such partings were rare. Sickness meant solitude. A child with fever was placed in a shed, a loved one wrapped and left with a note. Forgive me, I cannot bury you myself. Gritild tried to restore what dignity she could. She tied prayers to the wrists of the departed, laid rosemary, lavender, whispered charms so their spirits would not wander. Still, it was not enough. The people grew quiet, shrinking from hope, from grace. One evening, 5 cloaked figures arrived with a cart from Wexcombe. Their tale was one of desperation. Their cart bore 3 dead. They asked only for rest, for soil. But Farsley turned them away. Even Father Alwyn, voice heavy with grief, said, "We are no longer a place of sanctuary, only of survival." The cart rolled away, trailing its sorrow. Some say the bodies lie in the woods, others believe the travelers perished before dawn. After that, silence deepened. The pestilence did not roar, it crept, in breath, in touch, in stillness. And each day the bell tolled again. More doors shuddered, more prayers whispered behind closed eyes. One morning, Grethilde stood at the chapel gate. She watched Cedric bury two more. Her hands scattered fennel and rue into the misted air. Father Alwyn joined her. "This is not how it should be," he murmured. "We were meant to die with grace." Grethilde's gaze did not waver. "There is still grace," she said, "but it no longer waits in the chapel. It waits where courage survives." He did not understand, but he did not argue. And that evening, the bell rang once more. Death, long a stranger in Farsley, now walked its streets like a weary friend. Known by name, long before the first cough was heard in Farsley, before the fever took hold of Elric's brow or the bell tolled for the dead, the wind had begun its journey. Not the wind of weather or season, but the silent breath of affliction, riding unseen from caravan to port, from ship to shore, from one trembling hand to another. It traveled roads paved by trade, paths beaten by pilgrims, and sails stretched by conquest. To understand the scourge that darkened Farsley, one must look eastward, past meadows and hedgerows, beyond the sea and its salt-white cliffs, into lands where the sun touches earth before England stirs. There, in the wide steppes beyond the Caspian Sea, whispers began. Goats fell, rats scattered, strange swellings grew in the flesh of men, heat raving through their veins. The sickness took the Silk Road like a thief in twilight, slipping past guards nestled in silks and spices. It came to the cities of the Levant, to Constantinople, where the sea glitters and minarets pray, then to Europe's ports, Venice, Genoa, Marseille. There the sailors coughed and died. Rats poured from ships like shadows, and fleas too small to name fed unseen. By the time England heard the rumors, it was already too late. Pilgrims brought stories, cities silenced, birds mute, air foul. But who turns away a soul who walks for God? So they were welcomed, and with them came death. London fell like a bell struck hard, southward first, then the veins of the land. The sickness seeped into the soil, into breath, into silence. Farsley, tucked away, was spared for a while. But all it took was one breath. A peddler in spring, a friar who preached and vanished, a fox, a mist, the villager's guest. But the truth was deeper. For in those days, disease was not just a wound, it was a reckoning. It came for the sinful, some said, for the proud, for the disbeliever, yet it spared no one. It swept through kings and serfs alike. The wind bore no judgment. In Farsley, only fragments arrived, a monk's tale of Aragon, a letter from Bruges, a song of black boils, hints and hauntings. Grethilde, listening always, knew. She had seen the moon's warning, heard the silence of birds, dreamt the omen's shape. "The east has breathed upon us," she whispered, but none truly listened. Isambard kept to his texts. His candles burned long, his hands ever gloved. He feared now, even as he clung to names and humors. But the plague did not care for scrolls. It followed men, and men still moved. Merchants sought silver, monks walked paths, soldiers marched, and wagons still creaked beyond the trees. Grethilde saw it clear. This was not a wave. This was the sea. It would come again, in silence, in songs, in hoofbeats and breath. Farsley was not alone. The world had opened wide its doors, and the wind would not forget the way. Long before sickness was understood, it was suffered. And in suffering, people clung to whatever promises were given, however crude, however painful. In the medieval world, medicine was not science. It was a fragile dance, between old texts, the stars above, the prayers below, and always there was blood. In Farsley, healing was practiced by both scholars and shepherds, by parchment and poultice. Yet when fevers rose and breath grew thin, the blade was never far behind. Magister Isambard believed, as many did, in bloodletting. He held fast to the wisdom of Galen, to the teachings etched in time. The body was balanced, and when blood overfilled the vessel, it must be let out. He showed the villagers with calm words, with drawings on wax. He opened veins gently, watched the blood pour. Pale meant weakness, dark meant corruption. The bowl did not lie. And still, children died. Little Oswin bled thrice, could not endure. His breath fled in the night, his lips pale as frost. But the blade remained. Leeches drawn from the marshes became the softer hand of medicine, pressed behind ears, at ankles, upon temples. They fed quietly. Some felt lighter after, others simply wept. Isambard brewed draughts, emetics to purge the gut, gentian, mustard, vinegar. The cups brought retching, heaving emptiness. Then came the cautery, the iron rod seared red pressed to the skin, meant to draw sickness outward through fire. The scent of scorched flesh clung to the wind. Few volunteered. Some were forced. Grithilda watched it all, grinding sage, her eyes like storm clouds. They bleed away life, she whispered, not sickness. Her teas brought comfort. Her hands soothed fevered brows. But she could not stop the plague. No one could. Medicine sought signs. In stars and phases of moon, sapphire amulets, crosses sewn into sleeves, trees hammered with iron nails, but the sickness cared for none of it. It passed through prayers and potions alike. And then, one morning, Isambard fell. He had bent low to tend a man, Berwin, mad with fever. A cough, wet and violent, sprayed blood across the scholar's cloak. 3 days later, a rash bloomed on his neck. The fever followed. He bled himself with shaking hands, drank his tinctures, spoke names of sages, begged ancient wisdom, but none came. He died alone. His scrolls stacked like tombstones, the leeches still swimming in their jar. And Farsley mourned not just the man, but the hope he had represented, for if even the learned could fall, what hope had they? So the people turned inward, to silence, to stillness, to waiting. They buried their dead, sealed their homes, counted the bells, and Grithilde, in her quiet garden, tended the green things still willing to grow, her heart heavy, for the blade had done its worst. And the worst was not over. In times of great darkness, people turned toward light, however faint, however flickering. For centuries, healing light had dwelled in stone-bound sanctuaries, monasteries where balm met blessing, where broth, bed, and whispered psalms wrapped the suffering in gentleness. St. Hildegard's priory stood to the west, nestled by the river's bend. Farsley folk spoke of its golden-scripted manuscripts and bees that hummed over herbs. Father Alwyn had studied there once. He remembered the scent of vellum and lavender, the hush of prayers beside crushed fennel. It had been a place of mercy. When plague came, he wrote to the priory, pleading, but no reply ever came. A traveler arrived instead, dust-caked and weary, a novice with hollow eyes. "They are gone," he said. He told of Brother Osric, the healer, of how he knelt beside the sick, of how he was the first to fall. Then the others followed. They tried everything, rosemary smoke, midnight psalms, sacred gates locked tight. Still the disease found them. The priory grew silent. The novice buried them alone with only the ravens to bear witness. Father Alwyn wept. His own chapel remained open, though fewer came. Candles sputtered, pews stood empty. Those who entered no longer wanted sermons, they wanted reason. Why had God turned away? What sin had summoned this sorrow? Alwyn offered scripture, parables, psalms, but his voice too grew dim, and the people turned deeper into the shadows of faith. Some fasted until they fainted. Others scourged their backs with branches, leaving trails of blood in the soil. They marched barefoot, chanting through the woods. Holy relics were paraded, fragments of the true cross, bones wrapped in velvet, vials of sacred spring water. Lips touched them, even as illness lingered, but still the dying did not cease. A little girl passed, just 4 winters old. Her mother carved crosses into every wall, her prayers sharp as thorns. When she emerged days later, she was pale as frost and hollow as wind. Faith had changed. It no longer glowed. It burned. Father Alwyn watched. He did not abandon his chapel nor his flock, but he ceased to preach. He lit candles in silence, rang the bell without words. The chapel became a quiet place, a place to sit, a place to breathe. Grithilde came once. She knelt, hands trembling, and spoke no word. Alwyn did not disturb her. He simply watched the flame of her presence. Outside, the river ran. The birds called. The sun rose. But the sacred was fading. Monasteries now lay still. Chants no longer echoed in cloisters. The herbs, untended, wilted beneath the sky. And faith, once a lantern, now smoldered like a dying ember. Cradled in trembling hands, it glowed just enough to last one more night. When death stalks the streets, silent and formless, it does not take long before someone is named its servant. In Farsley, as in countless corners of the old world, pain fermented into suspicion, and from that suspicion, blame took root. Whispers slipped through shuttered windows. Glances lingered too long on those untouched. Certainty, when it cannot be found, is forged. Someone must be responsible. Someone must have called the plague. And so they looked to Grithilde. Though her herbs had soothed fevers, though her hands had cradled the dying, her knowledge was ancient, older than the church, older than Latin. She spoke to wind, not to saints. She burned herbs beneath moonlight. She walks with cats, murmured a butcher's wife. She casts her prayers at crossroads, said a mason. Father Alwyn, ever gentle, cautioned, we must not mistake grief for truth. But grief had grown teeth. Then the mill burned. No cause was clear, but flames demand fuel, and fury found its match. Grethilde had been there, someone said. She has never buried a child, someone else whispered. By dusk, 5 men came to her gate. No words, only hoods and heavy hands. They tore her garden, crushed her herbs, marked her door, witch. Grethilde said little. Her candle burned behind her, tall and unblinking. She whispered to the wind and did not open her door again. But she was not alone in bearing blame. Ephraim, a dyer from the south, quiet and clean, did not kneel in mass. He read. He ate no meat. When the steward's son grew ill, they burst into Ephraim's home. His books were torn, his jars shattered. They found nothing, but still, they dragged him to the chapel crypt. That night, the wind wailed. 2 more died, and the fear spread. Those who were different, foreigners, wanderers, the quiet, the poor, became threats in the minds of the grieving. Across Europe, the same story unfolded. In London, whispers turned to riots. In Paris, the Seine bore blood. Always the same song, always the same beat. Fear, blame, punishment. Father Alwyn posted scripture upon the chapel door. Words of mercy, words of stillness. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. But not all could hear it. One morning, the chapel door was marked with ash. A crude woman's face, horned and hissing, carved above the threshold. Alwyn washed it in vinegar, lit a candle. It burned for 3 days without dimming. Grethilde watched from afar. She said nothing. But when the winds turned cold, she returned to her craft, quietly. Not for those who had cursed her, but for those still lost in suffering. The babes too frail to cry, the mothers with hollow cheeks, the elders who stared at nothing. She worked not for praise, but for promise, because healing is not a gift. It is a debt. And Grethilde, wise and weary, knew fear does not change the sickness, blame does not soothe the dying, and hate has never been a cure. Before the plague, life in Farsley was measured by seasons and bells, the sowing of barley, the shearing of sheep, the sweet weight of apples in a child's apron. Time passed like a lullaby, sung in sun and soil. St. Osyth's bells rang for mass, for meals, for markets. The square was laughter, the air filled with flax and gossip and wood smoke. But when the plague came, life slowed. Then it bent. Then it broke. Days became shadows, one smearing into the next. The bell rang only for death. Doors closed, chimneys dimmed, markets emptied, chickens clucked no more. Silence fell like ash. And so they turned to salt and soot. Salt lined windows, sealed doors, pale marks against wood formed into crosses, into circles, into hope. Ash was smeared with lard, with herbs, runes returned. Mirrors faced out to reflect evil back. None of it stopped the sickness, but it gave the frightened something to do, a rhythm, a reason. Bread was scarce, flour vanished. Bakers were silent. Some baked with barley mash, others with acorns. Meat cured long, often to rot. Water once drawn in song was now touched with fear, boiled, blessed, collected by moonlight with whispered charms of grandmothers long gone. Grethilde brewed her dandelion mead, rarely now, only for the near lost. It was not a cure, but it was a comfort. The sick were kept in barns, in lean-tos. Mothers pressed milk through shutters. Fathers prayed from yards away. Touch became peril, love a risk. Children were kept indoors. They forgot the linden tree, the taste of sweet pears. They learned silence, learned fear, their eyes too wide, too quiet. Even the animals changed. Dogs fell quiet. Cats returned slowly, perching in high beams. Crows gathered boldly near graves, counting, always counting. One day, red circles appeared on the chapel wall, then trees, then doors. A symbol of warning, of blessing, no one knew. Grethilde saw and smiled once. Not all signs are curses, she murmured. And still, the scent lingered. Sweet, sour, heavy. A scent that stayed in skin and dreams. Herbs burned day and night, lavender, mint, juniper. Yet still it clung. Pomanders became talismans. Cloth soaked in spice and vinegar, carried in palms, pressed to faces. Grethilde gave sachets to children. Smell strength, she said. Even Father Alwyn kept rosemary between his pages. Nights dimmed, candles rationed, fires low. Voices hushed, silenced. Yet life clung. A baby, born in the brewer's home, weak but breathing. Twins once pale, laughing again in fields. A widow sang to her husband's grave, not joy, but living. And then there was Cuthbert, a boy with chalk. He drew angels and suns on his cottage wall, smiling beasts, light, hope. When he finished, he stepped back. It's a new story, he said. The plague had not ended. But Farsley remembered to live each day, gently, quietly, is its own prayer. Bread salt offered, ash drawn with care, a defiance against the dark, a lullaby for the weary world. By the 10th month of the plague's reach into Farsley, the world had grown quiet, too quiet. A hush blanketed the fields and thatched roofs, broken only by the chapel bell or the wind threading through bare branches. Then one morning, a figure came walking, a silhouette on the pale horizon. He wore black from crown to sole, a cloak stiff with wax, gloves of dark leather, boots silent on the path, and a mask, pale and beaked, staring like a bird that had forgotten flight. Children watched from behind shutters. Elders muttered prayers. Even Grithild squinted. The plague doctor had arrived. He gave no name. His voice, muffled by herbs and cloth within his mask, was low and thick with myrrh and vinegar. He carried a staff, not for walking, but for keeping the living at bay. Born not from darkness, but desperation, he came from cities touched before, Venice, Avignon, Lubeck, a guardian in robes, a scholar cloaked in myth. His mask, stuffed with mint, rose, cloves, camphor, was meant to cleanse the air. His robe, waxed to repel death's breath, shrouded every inch, a figure between man and ghost. Farsley stirred. Some called him angel, others death in disguise. But he did not speak of doom. He worked. He entered the sickened homes, studied boils, took notes in red ink, burned linens, ordered the opening of windows and the shutting of doors. He marked homes with symbols known only to him. Some obeyed, others trembled. All watched. Grithild met him once beneath the chapel yew. "You walk like a raven," she said, "but your eyes watch like a man." He inclined his head. "You believe the air carries it?" she asked. He tapped the beak of his mask. "I believe the air holds breath, and the breath holds death. And yet you breathe," she whispered. "Through rose and rosemary," he replied. "Through time and time again." "Will it end?" A silence passed. "Not yet," he said. "The world has not yet finished weeping." He moved on, his staff ticking softly against the earth. He worked day after day, marked homes, boiled cloth, accepted no coin, only bread and curd, once a jar of honey taken with the barest nod. Children watching began to play him, beaks carved from gourds, herbs tied to sticks. They marched through empty lanes, mimicking hope. One night, fire glowed beyond the northern fields. The doctor boiled cloth in iron pots, the steam thick with cloves and vinegar. Grithild watched. She no longer questioned his ways. Old and new, they stood watch together. But even the plague doctor was not immortal. One evening, he did not return. His last patient, a young stable hand, had burned with fever. The doctor entered alone, stayed until the moon rose high. When he emerged, he leaned on his staff like a man grown older by years in an hour. At dawn, his mask lay upon the chapel steps. Empty, no grave was found, no body seen. A note, pressed within Father Alwyn's Bible, remained. The mask does not protect, it reminds, that we face death not as cowards, but as caretakers. And so the figure in black passed into legend. But when the wind blew cold, children still played at being him, still wore the beaks, still whispered to the sky, for in a world undone by illness, even the echo of hope was worth wearing. Long before the plague, words traveled on the backs of horses, in the pouches of couriers, and between the lines of merchants' ledgers. Letters bound sister to brother, trader to port, shepherd to scribe. Ink bled into parchment with care, ribbons tied, wax sealed. They moved like veins, living threads through a kingdom's heart. But now, the letters had stopped. The last to reach Farsley came in spring, its seal broken, its script trembling. They are dying quickly now. Do not come. After that, nothing. Roads once alive with wheel and footfall grew empty. Inns stood hushed, signs creaking to the rhythm of wind. Horses wandered, untethered. Bridges bore only the prints of birds and beasts. Silence became not just soundless, but severed. Villagers no longer knew if others still breathed beyond the ridge, if laughter echoed across the valley, if the names once spoken still belonged to the living. So they began writing, still. Ilsa the spinner sent words into hope. I am still here, she wrote. Look to the sky on St. Bridget's Eve. She tied them in string, placed them in a box, her quiet ritual of waiting. Old Tom carved into planks, Ruth lives, Elric is gone, Farsley remembers you. No one passed to read them. Children born into quiet asked, what is a neighbor? Is there still a king? Their world was fields and fences, a goat's face, the hush of prayers that never ended. Even the stars seemed farther now. Grithilde wrote her thoughts between pages of herbs and remedies. A child smiled today, just once, but it was real. The fever has not returned since solstice. I do not think the world has ended, only paused. She hid her words behind yarrow and bonewort, not from fear, but for the future. Then, one autumn, something arrived. A letter, carried by wind, found in a hedge, spotted by a girl named Leona. We live, it read. In Sindale, 10 of us. If you read this, leave a sign. Hope stirred. Stones were marked with chalk and placed beneath the old oak. Days passed. And under the new moon, a jar appeared. Inside, parchment, dried thyme, and a note. We saw your mark. We are still here. Let us survive together. A ritual began. With each new moon, the jar was exchanged. Letters, dried berries, a thimble of honey, a child's poem. The silence cracked, and through that crack, light returned. Grithilde called it the jar of breathing. Ilsa wept, then wrote again, if you live, I do too, and I will wait. The bells still tolled, the road stayed empty. But the world remembered itself, not as islands, but as bridges, unseen, unsent, but never unloved. While the body bore the sickness and sores, in fevers, in gasps for breath that never came deep enough, the mind suffered a quieter plague, one without name, without fever, but no less deadly. In Farsley, grief no longer wept. It sat silently beside every hearth. Shoulders stooped, words were lost, eyes stared into nothing. Some whispered to shadows. They called it the hush. Grithilde called it grima, the old grief, not for what was gone, but for what would never return. It began in dreams, water, too little, fire that did not warm, roads that led nowhere, familiar faces speaking in strange tongues. Children cried in their sleep, widows stayed awake, laughter thinned to win through hollow wood. A boy named Aldrich slept in stables, afraid of roofs. The ceiling falls, he said, always falls. Mela the widow stopped sleeping at all. Her candle burned through night, too much, she whispered. Games faded, dolls lay untouched. Children played at dying. Father Alwyn saw it in his altar boys. Their shoulders slumped, their words faltered. One forgot the Lord's Prayer. Another asked, why pray if the dead still die? Alwyn dreamed too. Bells tolling endlessly, doors open to emptiness. Saint Osith weeping blood. He said nothing, just lit more candles. Grithilde, wise and worn, said, there is no herb for a shattered spirit. But stories, she began telling them again. Tales of forests that walked, rivers that healed, laughter that chased wolves. At first, only children came, then others. They listened, not for truth, but for shape, for warmth, for something other than silence. Ilsa dreamed of her husband's empty face, Leona of her doll leaving her, Cuthbert of a world without birdsong. But stories softened the sharp. Some carved runes, painted eyes above their beds, sang old songs backward. Garel, the gentle shepherd, wandered naked. Spoken rhymes, thought his sheep were saints, died smiling beneath the stars. A woman flew sails from her roof. A boy buried his toys, they had betrayed him, he said, and still the plague lingered. Slower now, quieter, but still present, like breath held too long. Grithilde left herbs on doorsteps, mugwort, valerian. She tied bells to trees, drew chalk circles, proof she was still here. Father Alwyn read aloud once more, not sermons, but psalms. He leadeth me beside still waters, but some did, because when the world unravels, even the echo of beauty is an anchor. The sickness took bodies, now it hunted minds, but minds, fragile though they be, still dreamed, and in dreams the path remained, narrow, winding, but still there. Long before the plague, death in Farsley was a solemn visitor. It came in winter, mostly, when the snow lay thick upon the fields, or when the frost crept in through the thatch. It took the old first, those whose bones had grown brittle and voices soft. Their names were remembered, carved in wood, whispered in candlelight. Each death was a wound, yes, but a familiar one. But when the sickness came, death changed. It became fast, unfeeling, insatiable. And in its wake, it left not just grief, but confusion. How many had truly died? The villagers no longer knew. For in the haste of burial, in the fear of contagion, the rituals of remembrance had crumbled. Graves were dug quickly, shallow in some cases, or left unmarked. Entire families vanished in a matter of days, their homes boarded shut, their stories silenced. And without record, without prayer, the names began to fade. Grethilde saw it first. She walked the graveyard in the early dawn, her feet crunching softly upon frostbitten grass, her fingers trailing across headstones too few in number. There were too many missing, too many whose memory hung only in the hush between heartbeats. She brought it to Father Alwyn. "We must write them," she said. "Each one, or they will be lost a second time." Alwyn, weary-eyed but resolute, nodded. And so began the ledger. It was an old book, bound in dark leather and kept for years in the chapel's back room, a place once reserved for accounts, for tithes and offerings. Now it would serve a higher purpose. Each page bore a name. No sermon, no verse, no flourished script, just names, in some cases only a first name or a family's mark. If nothing else could be found, Grethilde offered a description. Old man with hawk ring, lived near the west field. They worked together, her memory and his ink, slowly, methodically. Cuthbert remembered the girl who sold flax. Ilsa recalled the boy with one ear. Even the children helped, piecing together names like fragments of a shattered mirror. Some entries were simple. Thilda, mother to Elric, died 7th day of fever. Beatrix, flax spinner, buried near orchard wall. Others were longer, heavier. Oswin, age 5, laughed at shadows, loved bread crusts, sang to geese. Mela, widow, did not speak for weeks, died holding her husband's boots. And then, the pages for the unnamed. Woman in green shawl, found near the well. 3 siblings, buried together under the linden tree. No family known. Each entry was written with care, not as a record of death, but a promise of memory. But memory, like breath, can be fragile. One day, Father Alwyn stopped writing. His hand trembled too much, his vision blurred. Grethilde took over, her script narrower, her lines more angular. The ledger grew, from 20 names to 40, then 70, then more. The binding began to loosen, the corners smudged with soot and salt. Yet still the pages turned, each one holding a story that would not otherwise be told. But not everyone wanted to remember. Some villagers looked away when the ledger was brought out. What good is memory, they asked. The dead don't hear their names. Grethilde disagreed. The dead do not need ears. They only need silence to be filled. Others feared the book, believing it to carry the curse itself. A mason refused to let his son's name be added. If I do not speak it, perhaps he is only lost, not dead. Even Father Alwyn questioned the purpose. One evening, as rain lashed the chapel windows, he sat beside the flickering candlelight and said softly, "Perhaps God has already counted them. What use is our list if heaven knows more?" Grethilde did not answer. Instead, she placed a sprig of yew between the pages and closed the book gently. For some, the ledger became a relic. They visited it as one would a shrine. Ilsa placed a small carved button upon the page where her sister's name was written. Cuthbert drew a bird beside his grandfather's entry. In time, the book was not kept behind the altar, but laid open each morning in the chapel's center, a stone weight resting atop the current page to keep it from closing. Visitors came, even from beyond Farsley. One woman, cloaked in gray, traced her fingers along a name and wept without sound. Another brought a strip of blue cloth, embroidered with stars, and laid it beside a line simply marked Aiden, apprentice. Laughed often. Word of the ledger spread. Other villages, those still clinging to life, began their own. Not all were bound in leather. Some were scratched onto walls, others painted onto stones, tied into woven cords, etched into tree bark. But all shared the same intent, to remember. For in a world where death had become common, memory was resistance. To forget was to allow the plague a second victory. To remember was to reclaim the face behind the fever. Eventually, Grethilde added the name of Magister Isambard. And though he had brought pain with his blades and bloodletting, she wrote him simply, physician, believed in balance, died seeking understanding. Because even folly, when born of hope, deserves a line in the book. As winter settled over the land, the ledger was nearly full. Grethilde stitched another binding to it, a second spine, reinforced with linen soaked in lavender oil. She sang as she worked, a low, ancient melody. When she finished, she turned to the last page and left it blank. Not because there were no more names, but because one day there would be none to write them. And still, the village would need that space to breathe, to hope, to remember what remembering meant. There is a strange truth that lingers in the shadowed corners of medicine. Even the healer, learned or lowly, cannot always save. And when the sickness is cruel, indifferent, and vast, knowledge becomes a candle against the wind. It burns, but not for long. In Farsley there remained but one healer, Grithild. She was not called such with ceremony or title. No banner bore her name, no coin exchanged for her hands. But as the months waned and others fell silent, hers was the only voice that continued to murmur lullabies beside the sick bed. Her hands, though gnarled, were still steady. Her mind, though heavy with grief, remembered the ways of earth and sky. She was not a physician. She did not speak in Latin. She did not own a scale, nor a book written on vellum. Yet they came to her still, and she did what she could. Each morning she rose with the birds, though there were fewer of them now. She ground dried angelica root and stirred it into warm ale. She steeped teas of lemon balm and feverfew. She mixed honey and garlic into pastes to rub upon chests that wheezed in the night. When wounds opened, she packed them with moss and myrrh. When breath grew shallow, she whispered to the ears of the dying, not to delay the end, but to ease the passing. But the illness did not care for herbs or prayers. It came whether one drank rue or rosewater. It claimed those who had never left their homes. And it mocked her mixtures by taking those she most wanted to protect. One day, the blacksmith's daughter, Rowan, arrived at Grithild's door, her cheeks flushed with heat, her breath sharp and ragged. She was 13 summers old and had once made garlands of daisies for the goats. Grithild did all she knew. She gave her cooled linen soaked in peppermint oil. She laced the windows with dried lavender and burned juniper cones in the hearth to cleanse the air. She sang to her softly, a cradle song from her mother's time. Rowan died 2 days later. Grithild did not weep. She knelt by the hearth and crushed fennel seeds until her fingers bled. The next was Wilmer, the carpenter's elder brother, a stoic man who had never married, who carved rosaries from walnut and gave them freely. He arrived coughing blood into a cloth he kept hidden in his sleeve. Grithild tried a bath of boiled bark and birch ash. She rubbed his chest with balm, fed him honey from the last of her comb. He smiled through cracked lips and called her a light in a house of ghosts. He died that evening. And still she worked. Still she gathered yarrow by moonlight and listened to the sound of footsteps in snow as if the rhythm might tell her something the books never could. One afternoon, she found a dead fox curled beneath her herb rack. No wounds, no rot, only stillness. She buried it with care and placed a feather in its mouth. That night, she dreamed of a field filled with breathless beasts, their eyes wide and unmoving, their limbs coiled as if in sleep, and in the middle of them stood a man made of smoke, holding a scroll that unrolled endlessly into the sky. When she woke, she wrote nothing down. Some things, even she dared not name. The village, though grateful, began to place less hope in healing. They no longer came to her asking for cures. They came for comfort, for rituals, for memory. Ilsa asked her to braid a charm into her daughter's hair, not to save her, but to give her something beautiful when the end came. Cuthbert brought her an empty jar and asked her to fill it with a sound so he would not forget what kindness felt like. Even Father Alwyn asked at last for her help. "My hands," he said, "are no longer strong enough to anoint the dying. Will you stay with them when I cannot?" She did, and she asked for nothing. But each death added weight to her shoulders. Each failed poultice, each breath that did not return, carved its own notch into her bones. She began to move slower. Her fingers stiffened. Her eyes, once like flint, now held more dusk than fire. She began to question, not the illness, it had never answered to reason, but herself. Was she truly helping? Were her herbs merely hope dressed in leaves? Were her songs just distractions from the inevitable? One evening, she sat in her garden with her hands resting in her lap. The rosemary was brittle. The mint had yellowed. She spoke aloud to the night air. "I have given you everything I know, and still you take." The wind replied only with silence. But then, from the far edge of her fence, came a small voice. "I dreamed of birds," said Leona, the orphan girl. "You sang them back into the trees." Grithild looked up. "I did?" The child nodded solemnly. You help the dreams stay kind. And just like that, her hands remembered their purpose. Not all healing came from the body. Some came from the gentle touch, the remembered name, the presence beside a bed when no one else dared stay. The healer's hand could not always cure, but it could comfort. And comfort in the time of plague was its own kind of medicine. So Grethilde stood once more. She gathered her tools, she prepared her herbs, not to fight the plague, but to stand with the living until the end or until the morning, whichever came first. In the world before the plague, grief had structure. It came dressed in black cloth and silence, in veils and psalms, in the slow toll of bells and the gathering of kin beneath church arches. There were meals shared, hands held, prayers whispered over grave mounds newly turned. Mourning had rhythm, and through that rhythm, sorrow found its place. But the plague scattered such order like leaves in the wind. Grief no longer knocked. It burst through doors. It did not wait for ceremony. It left no time for farewell. And so the people of Farsley had to learn to grieve again, but differently. Not with the rites they had known, but with what little they still possessed. And in that void, something new was born. They began with the table. Food had always been a language in the village. Bread given in thanks, stew offered in illness, apples pressed into children's palms. Now, with larders half empty and harvests uncertain, food became sacred. Every bite remembered someone. Every loaf was kneaded with a name in mind. Ilse was the first to hold what became known as a mourner's feast. Her daughter, Tilda, had passed quietly one dawn, a fever too deep to lift. She had no coin to carve a marker, no cloth fine enough for a shroud, but she had barley, and she had time. So she baked a flatbread, round as the moon, and laid it on her doorstep with a sprig of herbs atop it. She did not speak. She did not weep. She simply sat beside the bread until the sun touched its edge. By noon, someone had left a strip of smoked eel beside it. Another brought 3 hazelnuts. A child left a ribbon. By dusk, the bread was gone, but a warmth lingered. The next week, when the cooper's son died, Ilse did it again, this time for someone else. She left a slice of cheese, hard and cracked, and a plum from her tree. Others followed. And so the mourner's feast took form, not a banquet, but a gesture, not a ritual of opulence, but of remembrance. Simple food, laid on stone or step, in memory of the lost. There was no invitation. Those who knew the name came quietly, left what they could, and walked away. A strip of jerky for old Wilmer, who carved beads with wrinkled fingers. A lump of honeycomb for Mela, who once mended every torn hem in the village. A cup of goat's milk for little Aldrich, who always fed the lambs first. The offerings were never touched by hand again. By morning they vanished, taken by birds or wind or the earth. And that was enough. That was the point. Grief found a place not in the chapel, nor in spoken eulogy, but on the thresholds where the living and dead still brushed shoulders. Father Alwyn, though at first hesitant, came to embrace the practice. He left a clove of garlic for the plague doctor, whose name was never known. He whispered a prayer not in Latin, but in the common tongue. May this gift remind you we remember. Grethilde, too, contributed. She laid herbs in silent arrangements, sage for strength, rue for sorrow, rosemary for memory. She taught the children how to tie bundles of wildflowers and lay them atop loaves. She never asked for whom they were left. That knowledge belonged only to the giver. Sometimes the feast became a story. One evening on the chapel step, a carved wooden spoon was left beside a wedge of turnip and a strip of salted pork. No name was spoken, but everyone knew it was for Joran, the farmer who fed the poor in the lean winters, who carved spoons for every newborn. Another time, a single acorn was laid atop a flat stone, surrounded by tiny stones in the shape of a circle. A child's tribute, perhaps, or perhaps not. No one disturbed it. It stayed for 3 days. And once, after a night of thunder and wind, a bowl of oats was found on the chapel's highest window ledge, still warm. No one saw who placed it there, but someone had remembered. These feasts were not formal, nor planned. They were made with what the mourners had, and often that was very little, yet they became sacred through their simplicity. Each one whispered, "You lived, you mattered, you are not forgotten." Even those with no kin began to receive them. A nameless woman buried at the edge of the orchard found a wreath of holly berries one morning. A stable boy, who had died alone, received a corn cake shaped like a horse's head. The practice spread. Other villages, through jars and messengers, began to adopt the tradition. Small gatherings appeared on stone altars and roadside shrines. The dead, once lost in numbers, began to be counted again, not in ledgers, but in gestures. One day, Ilsa found a small loaf on her own doorstep, laced with cumin and wrapped in cloth. She opened it slowly and found inside a message, scratched in trembling ink, "For Tilda, whose song I still hear." She pressed it to her chest and wept. The mourner's feast did not end the grief, but it shaped it. It gave the hand something to do, the heart something to offer, the soul a way to say goodbye when words would not come. And slowly, it became a custom, not just for plague, but for life. Even after the illness waned and the bells rang less, people continued to leave small offerings, on birthdays, on solstices, on rainy days when memory returned too sharply. Because the mourner's feast was not about death, it was about presence, about love that outlives the body, about the taste of remembrance. And in Farsley, where the wind still whispered through the trees and the earth still bore names beneath its roots, grief had found its home. Not in ruin, but in ritual, long before the fever touched a brow or the bell tolled in mourning. Before the healer's hand trembled or the prayers grew hoarse, there were the rats. They had always lived among the people, unnoticed, uninvited, but never far. In barns, beneath floorboards, within thatched roofs and cellars damp with the breath of the earth. Brown and black, large and lean, they scurried through the alleys of cities and the folds of countryside life, eyes glinting with quiet cunning. No one feared them. Not truly. Not then. They were thieves. Yes, of grain, of cheese, of candle stubs, chewed to waxy ruin. But they were a nuisance, not a curse. Children chased them with sticks. Bakers muttered at them. Cats, where they remained, stalked them like shadows with teeth. And yet, in silence, the rats had become something else. They had become vessels. For it was not the rats themselves that brought death. It was what they carried. The fleas. Tiny? Unseen, barely noticed unless they bit, but in their mouths, a secret far deadlier than tooth or claw. Yersinia pestis, a name unknown to the people of Farsley, and yet more familiar than any they had spoken aloud. It lived in blood, thrived in filth, traveled through warmth, and when the fleas leapt from rat to man, they brought with them the end. In the great cities, they nested in straw pallets, in sacks of flour, in corners where coal was kept. In the countryside, they found fur found hay, and hay found humans. The sickness was born not in spirits, nor in sin, nor in wrath from heaven, but in the simple fact that a flea bit twice. Farsley had its share of rats. They skittered along the eaves of the bakery and nested near the old grain house. The villagers tried to trap them with bowls and stones, sometimes with poison made from lye and ash, but there were always more. It was Gretilde who began to suspect. She had watched the patterns too long, had felt the cycle of the plague rise and fall with the grain shipments, with the movements of animals more than men. She noticed how the illness clung to places where the rats were thickest, and how cats, once protectors, had become fewer, driven out by fear and superstition. One morning, she captured a rat herself, a large grayback creature that had been circling her herb racks. She kept it in a cage woven from willow branches, fed it crumbs, and watched it scratch and twitch. On the third day, it died. No wound, no fight, just stillness. She burned it with sage and recorded the hour. "I do not know what you carry," she whispered to the smoke, "but I know you do not come alone." She began to warn the villagers. "Keep your homes clean," she told them. "Boil your cloth, bury your waist deep, and if you see a rat, drive it out." Some listened. Most did not. They had greater fears, they said. What could a rat do that death had not already done? But the pattern was real. Father Alwyn noticed too. He began spreading sand soaked in vinegar along the chapel's baseboards. He instructed the children to tie rosemary around their ankles. He did not understand the science, but he trusted Grithild's eyes. Still, the rats remained, and still, the fleas leapt. In the cities, scholars who dared to dissect the dead found swollen lumps near groin and neck, foul-smelling and blackened. They called them buboes and knew them as signs of the plague's touch, but they did not know their cause. They bled the boils, they prayed, they burned the homes. They did not suspect the flea. How could they? It was too small, and the sickness too large. In Farsley, the rats grew bolder as the village quieted. They walked openly in the square at dusk. their whiskers twitching in air, heavy with ash and sorrow. They chewed through the sides of forgotten grain barrels. They nested in abandoned beds, under cradles where no child stirred. Grithhild, watching from her window, began to place lavender in every crevice, mint beneath each threshold. She created a paste from rosemary, garlic, and lard and smeared it along the rafters. She gave it freely to any who would take it. "The fleas fear scent," she said. "Let them find none." Still, the plague crept on, because the rats remembered the paths, and they left behind what they carried. Some in Farsley began to hunt them in earnest. The children, once too tired to laugh, found purpose in the chase. They sharpened sticks, set traps, sang songs of vengeance in rhyming couplets. "Rat, rat, sly and small, you'll not leave here at all." It became a game, a grim one, but it gave the young something to fight. One girl caught 17 in a fortnight. She named them after the days of the week and buried them in tiny rows behind the hay barn. But for everyone gone, 2 returned, because the truth, though none knew it then, was simple. The plague needed no army, just a mouth, a bite, a breath. The rats, in their way, were only couriers. They did not hate, they did not choose, they only carried, and what they carried was death. Yet even death leaves clues, and in time, when scrolls were opened and ink once again flowed, the scholars would discover what Farsley never could, that the war had not been fought against spirits, or stars, or humors out of balance, but against creatures too small to see, and the creatures that bore them. What the rats remembered, the world would one day learn. But for Farsley, it was already too late. The fleas had bitten, the fever had risen, and the name Yersinia would not be spoken for centuries. The first frost came like a blessing whispered on the wind. It crept over the hills of Farsley in silence, dusting the bare branches with silver, painting the grass with a delicate shimmer that crackled softly beneath careful feet. The air grew crisp, the skies cleared, and the morning breath of villagers curled like faint smoke from weary mouths. No one celebrated. They simply noticed. The frost lingered longer each night. Water pails began to glaze over before dawn. The birds, fewer now, flew low and silent, their wings quick with the urgency of change. The fields lay still. The earth slept beneath its growing crust of ice and hush. And with the frost came something else, a pause, a stilling of the fever. It was not a miracle. It was not sudden. The sickness did not vanish like mist before the sun, but its grip weakened. The bell, which had tolled daily for the better part of a year, grew quiet. The graveyard saw fewer spades. The candles burned longer. Fewer coughs echoed through shuttered windows. Fewer faces grew pale. Father Alwyn noticed it first in his bones. He had grown used to the ache of mourning, the sag of his shoulders beneath the weight of prayer. But as he walked the chapel aisle one morning, lighting the vigil flames, he felt something strange. Stillness. Not the stillness of grief, but of waiting, of something holding its breath. Grithhild, ever the observer, marked the frost's patterns on parchment. She studied where it fell first. On the orchard fence, the chapel's west wall, the ridge above the pond. She measured the thickness with a worn stick. She wrote, "The frost keeps the rats away. The fleas go quiet. The sickness sleeps when the cold breathes." And it was true. As the temperature dropped, the plague slackened. Fewer fell ill. Those who did recover more often. The scent of death, once so thick and constant, gave way to wood smoke and wet leaves. Still, no one rejoiced. Grief had made them cautious. The villagers did not lift their mourning veils. They did not reopen the tavern or sing around the fires. They did not touch hands or gather in warmth. Instead, they watched the sky. They listened to the wind, and they waited. But small things returned. Children began to speak again, not loudly, not often, but with growing curiosity. A girl asked for a story. A boy carved a whistle and played a tune. Bread was left at the chapel steps, not for the dead this time, but for those too weak to bake. Father Alwyn began to read the Psalms aloud once more, his voice trembling with something close to hope. "The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in." Grithhild planted garlic bulbs in frozen soil. "Spring will come," she said to no one in particular, "and we must be ready." For though the frost quieted the plague, it also brought hardship of its own. The cold bit hard. Firewood grew scarce. The last of the salted meat tasted of mold. Root cellars emptied faster than expected. and the river's edge froze over, denying easy water. Those who had survived the sickness now faced another test: hunger. But the difference was this: they faced it together. The village, once sealed in fear, began to open, tentatively, carefully. Windows cracked to exchange bread. Doors opened long enough to offer stew or share embers. They spoke across fences. They sang beneath scarves. And they remembered. Ilsa gathered all who could walk and led them to the chapel one midwinter morning. There, beneath the frost-laced eaves, they read from the dead men's ledger. Not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Each name spoken aloud was met with silence, then a stone placed beside the chapel wall. By dusk, a ring of stones circled the building. Rough, uneven, many marked with carvings or ribbon. It was not a grave, but a memory made solid. "Let them rest," Ilsa whispered, "and let us rise." Grithilde, though slower now, took to teaching again. She showed the children how to plant seeds in ice-warmed soil, how to read the frost's lines like runes of survival. She gave them the names of plants not by their cures, but by their patience. "Snowdrop," she said, handing a bulb to young Leona. "It waits beneath the cold, but when the sun returns, it remembers to bloom. In time, others return too." A cousin from the next village arrived with a sack of grain. A wandering monk brought salt and cloth. A cart rolled in bearing dried fish and a letter from Sindel. "We live, we remember." The frost had not defeated the plague. It had only slowed its march. But in that pause, the village began to breathe again. One evening, a boy set a bowl of soup on the steps of Grithilde's cottage. Inside it floated a sprig of thyme and a pebble with a heart carved into its face. She ate in silence. But when she finished, she placed the empty bowl on her windowsill and whispered, "Thank you." The frost deepened in the weeks that followed. Icicles hung like teeth from the eaves. The pond froze so thick that the children dared to walk upon it, sliding, laughing, falling, rising. And when the sun finally broke through the gray, sharp and golden, it caught upon the snow and turned the village to light. A light that spoke not of celebration, but of endurance, of a people who had weathered more than fever, who had remembered even in silence, who had prepared even in darkness, and who, with the frost, had found a second breath. Not new, but stronger. Long after the coughing ceased and the fever faded, when the fields lay quiet beneath their frost-covered cloaks, and the wind sang only of stillness, there remained the question that no one dared speak aloud. What had it all meant? The people of Farsley had lost nearly half their own. Names whispered once with affection were now spoken like blessings or left carved on bits of wood and stone. The children, though laughing once more, did not remember a world untouched by silence. The adults carried their grief folded into their garments, stitched between memory and breath. But the memory of loss, if not recorded, fades. And so, while the world turned slowly back toward spring, a few began to write. It began with Father Alwyn. He had always been a man of scripture, of sacred words and well-worn texts, but now, for the first time, he turned his ink to the living. He cleared the vestry table, sharpened his quill, and opened a fresh book, not the ledger of the dead, but one for the survivors. He titled it simply, Annus Dolores, the Year of Sorrow. Each entry was a chapter of witness. He wrote of the first cough, the first burial, the flight of the plague doctor. He recorded the rituals that arose, the mourners' feasts, the salt upon the sills, the jar exchanged beneath the fallen oak. He described the faces of those who endured, what they did, what they said, how they held one another, even when they could not touch. His ink trembled at times. Some pages bore smudges where his hand had paused too long, where tears had blurred his script. But he wrote on. Grithilde, too, began to commit her knowledge to parchment. She had always kept notes, scattered pages tucked in herb jars, symbols scrawled in the margins of recipes, but now she gathered them. She organized her thoughts as if she were planting a garden, in rows and cycles. She titled her book, Against the Unseen, Herbs and Hours. She did not speak of disease as a curse, nor as a punishment. She described it as a pattern, a disruption of balance, yes, but also a messenger. Each herb she listed came with a story, how it grew, how it soothed, how it failed. She included drawings by Leona and 2 other village children, their careful hands capturing the curve of leaf and stem. In the back, she wrote, The plague cannot be banished, but neither is it beyond learning. May those who read this walk slower and with kinder feet. Her handwriting was tight, precise. The ink she used was made from elderberry and soot, the quills from feathers she found near the stream. Ilsa contributed as well, though she claimed she had no talent for words. She stitched instead a long tapestry made from scraps of cloth gathered from those who had died, those who had lived, and those who still watched the skies. The tapestry wound like a story. At one end, a house with black smoke, at the other, a sprout breaking through frost. Between were shapes both known and imagined, a beaked mask, a ring of hands, a loaf of bread with a feather upon it. No one asked her to explain the symbols. They simply came, and she followed. Others, inspired, followed suit. The children painted images upon stones, suns, birds, faces with wide eyes and open mouths. They placed them at crossroads, beneath trees, and on window ledges. The weaver's apprentice began a book of riddles and rhymes told during the long nights of waiting. The old herdsman, who had never learned to write, scratched lines into the bark of the great linden tree, one for each day his wife had lived after falling ill. There were 72 marks, and each one was followed by a small leaf carved below it. Stories, once spoken, became words. Words became books. Books became memory. Memory became meaning. Outside of Farsley, others had begun to write as well. Monks in distant abbeys copied accounts of the pestilence. Physicians who had survived penned volumes of symptoms and strategies. Merchants recorded their losses. Families wrote names in Bibles and prayed over them. But many of these writings were filled with fear, with blame, with guesses cast as fact. They spoke of humors, of stars, of vengeance. What made the writings of Farsley different was not the knowledge, but the care. They did not write to control. They wrote to remember. One evening, the survivors gathered in the chapel not for prayer, but to listen. Father Alwyn read from his book. Grithilde read 3 pages aloud from hers. Ilsa unrolled her tapestry across the pews. And then, in the hush that followed, Leona stood up. "I want to write too," she said. "What will you write?" Alwyn asked, gently. She thought for a long moment, then answered, "That I was scared, but I still helped Grithilde tie rosemary. That my cat came back, that I am still here." And that was enough. That was everything. The villagers brought paper or cloth or pieces of bark. They brought charcoal and berries, bits of chalk, broken quills, and all through the night, by firelight and frostlight, they wrote. Not all were legible, not all were complete, but each was a testament. Each was a seed planted against forgetting. And though the ink would one day fade and the cloth would fray, the act of writing, the choice to remember, would echo far beyond their village. When future scholars found these texts, they marveled not at their precision, but at their honesty. When others read them, centuries later, they did not find science. They found humanity. Ashes and ink. Sorrow and strength. A record not of conquest, but of compassion. A map, not of escape, but of endurance. And so the lessons of Farsley lived on, not in scrolls stored in ivory towers, but in every story told by a fire, in every name whispered in prayer, in every page that began with, "I was there, and this is what I remember." When the last frost melted into the thirsty soil of early spring, Farsley stood like an old song remembered in fragments, some lines broken, others soft with sorrow, but still singing. It had endured, not untouched, not unchanged, but alive. The sun returned slowly, each morning rising earlier, casting longer fingers of gold across the crooked chimneys and shuttered windows. Birds, once fallen silent, began to call again, hesitant at first, like children testing their voice after weeping. Lambs were born in the lower pastures. The trees swelled with bud and blossom. Yet where the world stirred in renewal, the people faced a different season, one of reckoning. The plague had not taken everyone, but it had taken much. And now, the ones who remained had to decide how to begin again. There were fewer hands to till the earth, to mend the walls, to turn the wheels of daily life. Some houses stood empty, their doors hanging loose, their hearts cold and crumbled. The Coopers, once a family of 5, were now 2. The baker's cottage echoed with silence, save for a single sparrow who had built her nest in the flour bin. But the living did not look away. They started with the simple things. Ilsa gathered the children, those old enough to carry stones and stir dough. Together, they reopened the oven that had long gone cold. They cleared the ashes, patched the chimney, and mixed what little grain they had with dried apples and herbs. The first loaves were rough, barely risen, but they smelled of effort, and they fed more than hunger. Father Alwyn led the repair of the chapel roof, not with hired hands, but with neighbors. Each brought what they could: old shingles, a bundle of thatch, a hammer borrowed from the dead. When the first service was held beneath it once more, the air was cold, the pews sparse, but the candles burned with steady light. Grethilde tended to the earth. Her garden, once wild and overgrown from months of neglect, was now cleared gently. She knelt beside each root, whispering old words, coaxing life where only memory remained. Children helped her replant. Not just herbs, but food, beans, beets, onions. She taught them which leaves healed wounds, which soothed bellies, and which were best saved for winter. "We must grow," she said, "not only to live, but to stay." And stay they did. Some who had fled in the height of fear returned. A cousin came back to the orchard. A mason walked all the way from the coast, carrying only a carving chisel and a satchel of acorns. They did not find what they had left, but they found the ones who had endured. Together, they began to rebuild. The graveyard was given a new gate, carved from alder wood. The names from the dead men's ledger were etched into a stone wall near the linden tree, not to mark loss, but to affirm presence. These we carried. The chapel, once reserved only for sorrow, became a place of stories. Each week, one person shared a memory of someone lost, of a moment survived, of a kindness remembered. Leona spoke of her dream of birds. Cuthbert told how he and his brother had buried their mother, then built a bench from her broken bed. The children planted wildflowers in every corner, between cobblestones, around the well, even on rooftops where pigeons nested. Color returned to the village, and laughter, though quieter than before, returned too. Not all could move forward easily. Some lingered in grief, unable to touch the places where loved ones once stood. One man lived in the woods for weeks, returning only when a child left a bowl of soup at the edge of the trees each day. Others spoke only in fragments, as though language itself had to be relearned. But no one was left behind. The village, once isolated in silence, now wove its pain into unity. There were no grand speeches, no declarations, only the steady work of hearts refusing to close. One morning, the village square saw its first gathering for joy. It was not a feast, not truly, but it was a shared meal, beneath a sky filled with birdsong and breezes. There were bowls of lentils, wheels of cheese, and flatbread dusted with herbs. Ilse brought honey. Grethilde poured her last bottle of dandelion wine. Father Alwyn raised his cup, not with sermon, but with gratitude. "To the ones who stayed," he said, his voice soft, "to the ones who came back, and to the ones who carried us here." They drank, and in that quiet clinking of cups and spoons, something like hope settled into the stones. The village did not erase what had happened. They did not tear down the houses of the dead, nor remove the marks left by loss. Instead, they wove around them, like ivy finding new paths along old walls. The past was not forgotten. It was folded in. One day, Grethilde sat beside the chapel wall, now blooming with early roses. She opened her book and wrote, "We are not the same, but we are still." And that was enough. The world beyond Farsley would eventually learn more, of germs and fleas, of medicine and science. But those in the village knew a truth just as deep, that survival was not only a matter of body, but of bond. What the plague had taken, they could never regain. But what it had left behind, each other, they would not waste. And so, under skies no longer veiled in ash, the ones who remained began again, not because they had forgotten, but because they remembered. On the day the plague was said to have ended, the bell of St. Osyth's Chapel did not ring. There was no toll, no peal, no solemn chime sent soaring over rooftops and meadows. The rope, long worn smooth by the hands of loss, hung untouched in its stone chamber. The villagers, those who remained and those who had returned, simply awoke to stillness and found it unfamiliar. It was not a stillness born of dread, nor the hush of mourning. It was the kind of stillness that comes after weeping, after labor, after the long journey through night. It was not triumphant, it was not glorious, but it was peace. They marked it not with ceremony, but with breath. That morning, Ilse lit no candles. She simply opened her door and left it ajar for the sun. Grethilde tied no herbs to her fence post, only brushed her palm over the mint and marigold and smiled. Father Alwyn walked the chapel aisle with no book in hand, only the echo of his footsteps speaking the liturgy. The dead men's ledger remained open to its final page, a ribbon placed across the parchment where the ink had stopped. No name had been added in a fortnight, no new grave disturbed the earth. And so, in a way known only to those who had lived each hour of fear, they understood the plague had passed. But they did not call it over. They had learned not to speak too quickly, not to claim what might be taken. They had learned, above all, to measure time not by disease, but by presence. There was no feast, no dance, no banners unfurled in wind. Instead, they honored the silence. In that silence, they did what the plague could not undo. They remembered. Ilsa returned to her weaving. Each thread bore a name, each pattern told a season. Her loom sang a new rhythm, no longer only of grief, but of memory made beautiful. Grethilde wrote the last of her entries. She placed the pages in a chest with the dried seeds of her garden and whispered, "Grow where you are needed." Father Alwyn gave his first sermon not of death, but of continuance. "The bell does not ring," he said, standing in the golden hush of morning, "because the silence must speak first." He paused, then added, "We lived. We lived. That is the whole of it. And still, the bell stayed quiet." Outside, the village stirred. Children, so long accustomed to shadows and hush, began to run again. Their laughter was hoarse at first, like birds singing after a storm, but it grew in brightness. They chased each other through the orchard, their feet scattering petals that had fallen too soon. New life began where the old had rested. In the fields, green shoots pushed through soil that had once cradled the dead. The goats birthed twins. The well, cleaned and blessed, sparkled with morning light, and in the hearts of the villagers, something delicate and trembling began to rise. It was not happiness. It was not even hope. It was trust. Trust that the next breath would come. Trust that hands would meet other hands. Trust that the worst had been endured and that what followed could be shaped. And so, slowly, life began again. One stone at a time, they rebuilt. One letter at a time, they wrote. One dish, one dance, one story at a time, they remembered how to live. And the bell, silent as it was, became a symbol, not of loss, but of restraint, a promise. When we ring again, it will not be for sorrow. Some said the bell was cursed, others said it was sacred, but no one touched it. Years would pass. The children would grow. New faces would settle in Farsley, drawn by its quiet, its flowers, its legends. They would ask about the bell, still silent in its tower, and the old ones would smile gently and say, "It waits," like we once did. They would tell stories of a time when bread was left for the dead, when a plague doctor vanished into the mist, when rosemary guarded doorways and the sky was watched like scripture. They would speak of Grethilde, who healed without promise, of Ilsa, who wove the faces of the lost, of Father Alwyn, who taught silence to be sacred. And they would say it did not end with a cure. It ended when we chose to live. The world would change, others would forget. But in Farsley, the past was not buried. It was planted, and from it flowers grew. So no, the bell did not ring, not on that day, not for the plague. But perhaps one day it would ring again, for love, for planting, for birth, for joy so bright it needed sound. Until then, it waited, high above the chapel, a bronze heart in a stone tower, watching, remembering, and reminding that even in the darkest time, when breath was short and fear was long, the heart of a village had continued to beat. And that, in truth, was all that ever needed to be said.